I'll give a minute for our Zoom audience. They're in? Okay. Well, welcome back. It's a pleasure to begin this morning's proceedings after last night's wonderful keynote and reception. I should introduce myself. My name is Nicholas Herman. I'm the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator at the Schoenberg Institute here at Penn Libraries. Before beginning today's proceedings, I'd just like to remind everyone that this afternoon at 5 p.m., you are all invited to a tour of the current exhibition in our Goldstein Gallery, which is just over there, an exhibition entitled The Movement of Books, which is very much keyed to the theme of the Symposium, and curator Dot Porter will be leading that tour. And also those joining us on Zoom are welcome to attend virtually, as one of us will be following around the exhibition with a smartphone, and so you'll be able to get a pretty good view even if you're joining us on Zoom. And for those of you here in the flesh, I'd like to remind you that at lunch and at all of the breaks today in the Lee Library over here, we have a wonderful pop-up exhibition on the theme of circulation. Please be sure to take a look. We have a few fun surprise items from our collection that you can look at. And also, Dot reminded me that in the Vitale Media Lab, which is the first room here on the left, at lunch, that'll be open. There's materials from yesterday's Making and Remaking Medieval Manuscripts workshop. So if you're feeling more sort of arts and craftsy, you can take a look and freely experiment in the Vitale Lab with scissors and glue. You can't do that in the Lee Library, just to be clear. Finally, I realize this is very much preaching to the choir, but I'd like to remind everyone who hasn't signed up to please sign up for our SIMS monthly newsletter. You can do that on our website, schoenberginstitute.org. Now I'd just like to give a few brief opening remarks before I turn things over to our first panel and to our first moderator, Sean Quimby. A few remarks on our theme this year, which is a capacious one, and yet in which its individual instantiations, the individual instantiations of circulation, are of course extremely specific. In our age of invisible bits and bytes moving at light speed and seemingly without effort, we tend to take for granted the literal pathways that our data took to get to us. But of course, in the pre-modern world, exchanges of information were always more direct, more haptic, more material, more concrete, perhaps more intentional. In a very direct sense, a book cannot convey knowledge unless it is physically displaced, either off the shelf or across a continent. And by extension, we as historians cannot access such events if they are not somehow recorded by some kind of trace. Such a realization prompts a riff on the famous saying, if a book is on a shelf but nobody reads it, does it really exist? These questions were brought home to us here at Penn about 10 years ago when a scholar noticed via our digitization platform, OPen, that 2 Seljuk-era manuscripts in our possession were in fact not ours at all. They had been stolen from the Yusuf Aga Manuscript Library in Konya, Turkey at an unknown date. Following the ensuing investigation, it was found that the thieves had replicated the manuscript covers and replaced them on the shelves of the historic library in Anatolia. In more than a decade, no one had reported the manuscripts missing, as no one had attempted to access them. The illicit circulation of artifacts worldwide is, of course, a complex and multifarious problem. But the basic fact in this instance is that our digitized images, made available openly and freely, prompted not only the discovery of this theft and the restitution of these objects, but also uncovered a far more extensive network of thefts from the same library, and eventually led to further positive outcomes in addition to the restitution of the manuscripts, far stricter safety protocols, and a heightened awareness of the precarity of local cultural heritage. I mentioned this startling anecdote, which in a previous era might have been covered up or willfully forgotten, only to bring home the idea that circulation, be it physical or digital, can have good or bad outcomes. Ultimately, it's up to us in the present to make the best of the free circulation of information. To paraphrase another important axiom, the movement of information has many ramifications, but in the end, these ramifications must be bent towards the good. And so this year's topic takes the notion of circulation as a starting point to consider not only how manuscripts produced in various contexts conveyed information, but also what those mechanisms of conveyance were, how these mechanisms have generated, shifted, and complicated the movement of books and other historic handwritten documents from their time of production to the present day. The 2024 Symposium happily marks the full implementation of the new digital scriptorium catalog, a tool par excellence for the circulation of information. And we saw the DS catalog's power so elegantly demonstrated in our wonderful keynote last night by Lisa Fagan-Davis. As we'll hear tomorrow, this was a tool developed in collaboration with the Schoenberg Institute and with the institutional members of Digital Scriptorium, the consortium. And in many ways, this is the model of the collaborative circulation of information. Hopefully, it and the many other research projects and initiatives highlighted over these next few days will provide inspiration for our continuing efforts to maintain and expand free, open, and innovative access to our intellectual heritage, even in the face of what can sometimes seem like tremendous opposing forces. And so, with these words of welcome, I'd like to call upon our first moderator, my colleague, Sean Quimby.
Yay.
Thank you, Nick. Welcome back to our audience, and good morning. Our first panel takes up the theme of textual circulations in three different geographical contexts, Greater Syria, Western Europe, and Central Asia. I'm going to introduce each speaker as they give their paper, and then we'll reserve time for questions at the end of the session. For those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to pose questions, as that will be monitored by one of my colleagues. We'll begin this morning then with Konrad Hirschler's paper entitled Patterns of Book Circulation in Islamicate West Asia, 13th through 18th centuries. Professor Hirschler is Professor of Middle Eastern History with the Institute of Islamic Studies and Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures at the University of Hamburg. His work focuses on the medieval Middle East between 1100 and 1500. In his faculty bio, he tells us that the study of written artifacts has become increasingly central to his work, especially the history of reading, libraries, methodological issues linked to documentary sources and archives, as well as questions of provenance. His most recent monograph is 2023's Owning Books and Preserving Documents in Medieval Jerusalem, the Library of Burhan al-Din al-Nasiri. So please welcome Professor Hirschler to the podium. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean, for the introduction. Wonderful to be here, obviously following the activities of the Schoenberg Center for many years, and it's a kind of feeling of finally being there where I've wanted to be for a long time. Okay, so what I want to do in this talk is to try to take my specific work on case studies onto a more general level and address three issues which I hope are also of relevance for other people here in the room working on other regions and other traditions. The first one is to think about circulation and warfare. The second one is to think about circulation and changing scholarly fashions, scholarly patterns. And the third one is about the impact of urban development on trajectories of circulation. So each of them will be done by the way of a case study looking at one specific artifact, which you see here on the slide. The first topic I want to address is the impact of warfare on book circulation, more specifically the topos of library burning, which obviously always has a high traction when it comes to books, and is, let's say, the most extreme case of non-circulation. For this, I will take a case study from the Crusader period. Where else to begin if one wants to think about violence and books, namely Tripoli on the coast of modern-day Lebanon and its conquest by the Frankish Crusaders. And I will show that what we see here is a pattern of an emerging Levantine Frankish Arabic manuscript culture, and also looking at the patterns of circulation within this manuscript culture. Here I will argue that warfare does not primarily lead to the destruction of books, but rather to the translocation, and I will do so by looking at endowment notes and material damage at manuscripts. Okay, so the case is as follows. We are in the 11th century. There's a big empire on the southern Mediterranean shore, the Fatimid Empire. We have the city of Tripoli. In the 11th century, we have a family, local notable family called Banu Ammar, and they are converting their administrative role and religious charisma into political leadership. They become the governors for the empire, and as so often, they break away after some years, and they create their own lordship in the 1070s, i.e. just before the arrival of the Crusades. This emergence of local lordships is a very strong phenomenon which we see during this period in southwestern Asia, and this leads to cultural patronage as the different courts are in competition among each other. They bring in scholars, they bring in litterateurs, they want to have libraries, they want basically to show that they are real rulers. And in Tripoli, they found something called House of Knowledge, which we can broadly think of as a college, where they also have a large-scale library. And this brings us to the topic of this talk. In 1109, the Franks conquered the city. Tripoli was the last major city to fall on the Syrian coast as a result of the First Crusade. What exactly happened in the days after the conquest is very unclear. As usual for conquest narratives, the number of victims, etc. But what interests us here today is the fate of the book. So what happens to the library of Tripoli? And we know that there was a library in the House of Knowledge. We know very little about it. There's no documentary evidence, inventories, book lists, or anything like that. We have description in narrative sources, in chronicles, and they mention numbers which are very unlikely, like there were 100,000 books in that library, there were 400,000 books in the library, which obviously not statistical information, but means there were a lot of books in that library. This is one of the narrative sources. This is the earliest Arabic source which we have, describing the conquest. And in it, the author said that it was, that's the wrong way, that the city was conquered by sword. This is highly disputed. We don't know whether it was taken by treaty or by violence. But most importantly, he says that they, the Franks, plundered everything, including the books in its college and in the library of private owners. They don't say anything about book burning or book destruction. This changes if we jump to the present. This is the Wikipedia entry on the conquest of Tripoli. Nothing against Wikipedia. I mean, they are just reflecting scholarship. It's not the badness of Wikipedia. It's just that they have specific emphasis. And there we see 100,000 books, volumes of the Dar al-Ilm library were deemed impious and burned. So really fascinating. I mean, there's no contemporary chronicle. And the next 200 years in Arabic, Latin, or Old French, whoever mentions the destruction of books, but today it's a fact. And it's a fact which is not only in Wikipedia, it's also, if you look at Timothy Verning's A Chronology of the Crusades, where he just matter-of-factly states, famous library of the Banu Ammar dynasty burned, full stop. And if you take the book Livre en Feu, Histoire de la Destruction sans fin des bibliothèques by Lucien Poulastron, which focuses on this topic again, he matter-of-factly states, Library of Tripoli was just burned. But the silence of the chronicles obviously makes this very problematic. But so far, we have not really had any evidence to the contrary, i.e. that the book survived. There's not a single manuscript in this world which we have been able to ascribe to Tripoli. So we were kind of in an argumentative void among ourselves. However, last year I was working in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts in Istanbul, and I came across this fragment, which is the title page of a book, which the other pages have been lost or not identified so far. The sub-collection in the museum consists of 200,000 fragments, damaged manuscripts, full manuscripts, which have never been classified. There are no class marks, never mind an inventory or catalog or anything. So nobody really knows what is in this collection. But so far, this is the only bit which I've been able to identify. On this title page, we find an endowment statement that tells quite a different story from the book burning story. Here we read that the ruler of Tripoli, Fakhr al-Mulk ibn Ahmad, the one of the family, endows the book to the college in the town. So that's wonderful, to the Dar al-Ilm. And this is the first extant fragment that we have from this library. And even more interesting is that he states that the book was, quote, retrieved from the hands of the unbelievers in the year 495, Islamic 1001 or 2, Common Era. I.e., the book was endowed in Tripoli after the conquest of Jerusalem, but before Tripoli was conquered by the Franks, i.e. in the 10 years after the arrival of the Franks in the Levant and before the fall of Tripoli. This context matters because the beginning of the endowment note and the end are pretty standard. This is what you find on any Arabic manuscript, but the bit on the retrieval is very uncommon. And most likely it refers to the fact that the book was ransomed from the Franks. And we know that the Franks sold books they plundered from Jewish libraries in the following year to Jewish communities. And what we see here is a book which was plundered from a Muslim library being sold to Muslim communities, i.e. in this case, the ruler of Tripoli. So what we hear is most likely a book which was I assume it was in Jerusalem. The Franks conquered Jerusalem in 1099. It moves into Frankish ownership. And then it was sold in the following year to the ruler of Tripoli, and it came into Muslim ownership. Arguably, there's also material evidence, this is very hypothetical, but I just couldn't resist bringing this. If you look at the fragment, you see here that there's a sewing where a part is reattached to the main title page, and this clearly happened after the title was written onto it, because here the stitching is over the ink, but it happened before the endowment note was written onto it, because here the ink is on the stitching. And when exactly it happened, we don't know, but it might be that during the conquest of Jerusalem, the manuscript was damaged, and then it was repaired when it came to Tripoli. And there is a certain logic to that, because this is parchment. And at this point, parchment was really weird in the Middle East. I mean, nobody used parchment. Parchment was old, it was something strange. They had 200 years earlier transitioned to paper. So a parchment thingy, in whatever form, was always something valuable, antiquarian, fascinating for manuscript user community. So what happened to such books of the college after the Frankish conquest of Tripoli? So coming back to the question, what happens? Library burned or not? And in order to understand what happened in 1109, when the Franks conquered Tripoli, we have to jump down to the present day institution holding this fragment, the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts in Istanbul. This is a museum that developed out of collections built up in the late Ottoman period, i.e. late 19th, early 20th century, when we see that the Ottoman state claims custodianship over cultural heritage, builds museum, builds state libraries, takes charge of excavation sites, etc. And this right of custodianship over cultural artifacts accelerated during World War I, when the Ottoman Empire lost territories. Well, they lost most of their territories, but they didn't know it by then. So when they lost territories, retreating troops were repeatedly ordered by the center in Istanbul to save cultural artifacts from the enemy troops. The Ottoman troops hated that. And they said, we really have other problems than dealing with these weird paper thingies or parchment things you want us to deal with. Let us just retreat. But it was a military order, and so they had to bring with them these artifacts to Istanbul. And among the territories that the Ottoman Empire lost was Syria, with the city of Damascus. And among the cultural artifacts which were brought to Istanbul by the retreating troops in 1917, was a collection of books and fragments from the main mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque. And that's the collection I've been working on and where this fragment is from. So in 1917, it was brought to Istanbul. Originally, this was in something called the Dome of the Treasury, which is in the center of Damascus and which had functioned as a kind of Geniza for many centuries. Damascus book owners and Damascene institutions of learning since the 12th century deposited worn-out books and documents in this dome. So these 200 fragments were in this dome. The cultural function of why they did so still eludes us. What we do know for sure forever is that most fragments and books were deposited between the 12th and 14th century. This is kind of the classical Dome of the Treasury period. There's very little going on afterwards. So that we can assume that a Muslim Damascene book owner put this book or the title page, whatever was left of it at that point, into this dome of the treasury between the 12th and 14th century. So the most likely scenario is that after the Franks conquered Tripoli in 1109, that the book again went into Frankish ownership, and they then again sold it to Damascus, which was not conquered by the Franks. And so that the poor book, as you can see, had quite a vivid history of circulation in the Levant during this period until it ended up in Istanbul in the early 20th century. So, quite tedious microhistory, I admit. But the main point I want to underline here is that this book tells quite a different story from that of burning libraries and of how Franks dealt with non-Latin script books in the context of warfare. And rather than burning the libraries, the new Frankish rulers appeared as new local book traders in this area. And this book trade clearly took place in the context of violence. But it is noteworthy that, I mean, in the end, the Franks used the books as most conquerors in world history have used books, i.e. in order to convert them to cash and to pay off their troops. And that's the way of how Muslim conquerors in the area dealt with books. When Saladin conquered city, one of the first things he did was plundering libraries, Muslim libraries, not Frankish libraries, Muslim libraries, and converting the books into cash in order to pay his troops. So here we see basically Arabic script manuscripts moving forth and back, but we also have examples of Latin script manuscripts, which also have quite vivid histories of circulation within the Levant, indicating this was a wider phenomenon of what might be called this Levantine Frankish Arabic manuscript culture. Just very briefly, there is something what I call the Damascus reuse corpus, parchment sheets that were reused in Damascus in order to produce manuscripts. And here we see a folio of a Latin breviary with musical notations, or rather one half of it. We see the stitching holes of the original on top of it. The folio was reused as a title page for the production of an Arabic manuscript in the 13th century. And the manuscript producer turned the folio by 90 degrees. That's why the stitching hole is on top of the new title page. He wrote the Arabic title on it, as well as the word endowment. Subsequent users left Arabic notes on the title page on the context of the manuscript. And they left also notes documenting the reading of it, i.e. when this text was read and where it was read. So, what this case has shown is one example of warfare leading to written artifacts being plundered, being removed, being endowed, being plundered again, being ransomed again, deposited in a Geniza-like storehouse, and then musealized or reused for producing new manuscripts, but not necessarily to destruction. And this brings us to the second topic I want to briefly address in this talk, namely book circulation and changing scholarly modes. Intuitively, we often assume that the survival of books is due to the fact that they had a cultural value, i.e. that usage communities took care of them and took an interest in them. But we quite often see quite the opposite, namely that books have only survived because they lost significance and people lost interest in using them. And this goes hand in hand with the second proposition, namely that the immobility of books, their non-circulation, is not per se an expression of books being highly valued, i.e. that they're being kept somewhere, but quite on the contrary, the immobility of books is often rather expression of the fact that they had ceased to be actively used, and a devalorization can be equal to immobility and, ironically so, to preservation. For this, I will look at one specific manuscript culture, which is Damascus in the medieval period, Hadith. These are the saying and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, of which we have roughly 10,000 textual bits and pieces, which can be rearranged in a high variety of textual formats. It's a very important source of Islamic law, and so many people took interest in putting these 10,000 textual bits and pieces together in different formats. And I will look at manuscripts which are exactly this one, which we saw previously, where we see the Latin breviary reused. This is manuscript culture in Damascus. Particularly, I will look at binding structures in order to understand the cultural logic of these manuscripts. The main point of these manuscripts are that they are composite manuscripts, i.e. they are manuscripts which consist of previously independent codicological units which were bound together at a later stage in their life cycle. So what might seem to be quires here, which you see here, which here are quires, de facto had been independent codicological units before they made their way into this composite manuscripts. They were composite independent codicological units such as this one, which is in Princeton in the moment. This is one of the few independent codicological units, pamphlets they might be called, which still survives as an independent codicological unit. This was not bound into composite manuscripts. This is the only one I'm aware of worldwide. All the others either have been bound in composite manuscripts or were destroyed. They are very small, as you can see. They are around 3 sheets of paper, and it's very low quality paper, and they were never bound. I mean, they were much too small to have a proper binding. What happened to them is that protective parchment covers were laid around them, such as the Latin breviary, which we have seen. So this is the material logic of this material, Latin material in these manuscripts. These were very actively read. What you see here in yellow is a reading note, a very common feature of Arabic manuscript cultures, where people say, I and 8 of my peers, and they named them, Ahmed, Muhammad, and Yunus, and Yusuf. We today, in the year 1335, were sitting in the Umayyad Mosque and reading this manuscript. And from these reading notes, of which we have tens of thousands, we see that these pamphlets were highly circulating in the 13th and 14th century. You can tell wonderful histories of circulation of these pamphlets within the city of Damascus, moving between different colleges, private homes, gardens, markets, and so on. But they fell out of fashion in the late 15th century. Scholarly interests turned to other textual formats. They did not lose interest in hadith, obviously, but they lost interest in these pamphlets. They basically were not useful anymore. And such pamphlets were often sold on the market as waste paper. But then in the very late 15th century, we see one Damascene scholar who's completely marginal, not important at all in many ways, but he embarked on something which we could call a cultural heritage safeguarding mission. He collected thousands of these pamphlets, which were still around in Damascus, and bound them into these composite volumes in order to preserve them. He produced over 150 of these volumes in his home. He did it on his own. And virtually all of these volumes have remained on the shelf of libraries in Damascus until today, over 500 years later, with only very few volumes departing to Paris. There are 3 volumes in Paris. These are the only ones which made their way outside Damascus. The other 147 are still in Damascus today. That these books have survived as such a complete collection was not because scholars took a strong interest in them and cared for them, but quite on the contrary, because there was no interest in them well until the 20th century. They have survived as the only medieval large corpus in Damascus. There's no other manuscript corpus of any scholarly field which has survived so intact. Much more vivid fields, such as Islamic law, we have a much smaller manuscript corpus. This one, which nobody took an interest in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, survived as such. And this is also because European Orientalists, who were buying a lot of manuscripts during this period in Damascus, considered them completely worthless in terms of content and in terms of materiality, and never bought any of these manuscripts, except the 3 which went to Paris. And they were, they got a class mark as Supplement Turc. And I mean, there's not a single Turkish word in them. So it shows that those who bought them had no interest in whatsoever in these manuscripts and said, it's kind of Turkish material, however they got that idea. So here we can see that falling out of fashion might be one of the better career moves for a book collection. And that in this case, disuse led to non-circulation, which in turn has favored the survival of the original collection context. Okay, and now to my last case. Now we are jumping ahead. The main proposition I want to make here is that the main destination for translocated books during the 19th century is linked to developments within Southwest Asia, North Africa, in this case urban development, and that these developments are central for understanding the reconfiguration of book collections in the 19th and early 20th century. So I want to make the case for the argument that the main destination for translocated Arabic Muslim books from Southwest Asia during this period were libraries in the region, not Europe's. The main actors who were driving book circulations were actors from within Southwest Asia and North Africa. And in consequence, the history of book collections in the 19th century was formed by these individuals. European actors, in contrast, played a rather marginal role. So you can feel that my main argument does not really go towards urban development, that this is basically one thing I want to show, but my main argument is that it is not very useful to center on European actors in order to understand book circulation. The reason for that being is that over the last years, obviously, thanks God, we have seen a very strong interest in proto-colonial and colonial violence for extracting books from Southwest Asia and North Africa, which is a very important topic. But the downside of that trend has been that suddenly everybody studies European actors and their deeds, and that the role of people in Southwest Asia and North Africa becomes marginalized once again in a way which is very reminiscent of 19th century scholarship. And that's why I want to emphasize very much that point. To argue that point, I will take the library of a mosque in modern-day Israel, the Al-Jazar Mosque in Acre, as an example of Levantine Ottoman manuscript culture, so another manuscript culture. And I will base it on a book list and library stamps on manuscript that had once belonged to the library. The mosque and the library was built by an Ottoman governor called Al-Jazar, who's fairly well known. He successfully converted Palestinian agriculture towards cash crop agriculture, cotton grain production for the markets in Europe, Manchester, Lyon. Not very pleasant for the peasants, as you can imagine, this process, but very pleasant for him building Acre, completely rebuilding Acre and building this massive mosque complex. This in turn led to a spectacular growth of this city of Acre that became one of the main urban centers on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, of which the mosque complex is until today the most visible landmark. If you have been in Acre, this is the one you won't miss. This is all well known, but his role in book history has remained rather unwritten. And this is changing now because some years ago, this inventory was discovered in Ankara, in the Museum for Endowment, Ministry for Endowment, and that lists the holdings, the books in the library when this governor died in 1806. It has become clear that the Jazar Library was one of the most spectacular book collections in Palestinian history, with over 1,800 volumes. And these books have virtually all disappeared. So this is what is still in the mosque today from these 1,800 books. Most of these books, which you even see here, were editions from the 20th century, early 20th century. And they have no connection to the original Al-Jazar library. So the dismantlement was even more radical than what you see here. In the end, out of the 1,800 manuscripts, 8 have remained in Acre, and 1,792 have departed to new destination. So book circulation is clearly a major topic in writing the history of this library. The question is, where have all the books gone? What has happened over the past 200 years? We put together a team of colleagues who have been working on this project. The book will come out in 3 months. And we've been working closely with the mosque endowment board of the Acre Mosque today and sharing the data with them. The books of this library have mostly disappeared in the 19th century, and our first working hypothesis was that this might have been part of the European proto-colonial encroachment in the region, which would have translocated the books to Europe and North American libraries. While we were finding, that's the book which will be coming out in 2 months. The finding which we have seen shows a very different picture from our first working hypothesis of this being a European-driven process. It is possible to identify the manuscript which once belonged to the Jazar library with very clear provenance marks, which you see here. This is one of the most spectacular manuscripts which was in that library. It's one of the masterpieces of the Arabic Chester Beatty collection. You have the stamp of the library and you have the endowment note on top of the title page, and that's consistently in all the manuscripts which we have identified. We only have identified some 100 manuscripts in libraries around the world, still very far from the 1,800, but at least it's a starting point to understand the underlying historical patterns of the translocation. The regional distribution of the manuscripts which we have identified shows that this is not primarily a European story. 37 manuscripts are still in the region today. 18 manuscripts made their way to libraries in Southwest Asia and North Africa. 21 made their way to the US and European collections. 21 is still a substantial number, but it's not the main number. And one has to remember that basically working on European and US American libraries is very easy. So they are always overrepresented in any corpus. So this is not how the end result will look like. Linked open data, I mean, it is not an issue for us working on the Middle East. I mean, the National Library of Cairo has definitely no interest in linked open data. They don't want it. I mean, it's not because they're bad or stupid. It's because they see it as part of, let's say, call it neo-colonial encroachment on their cultural heritage. So it's not something which we can dismiss as they not being there yet. It's something with which we have to seriously engage. But how we do it, the fact is that we have a large overrepresentation of European collections in our data, which I think is also represented in the wonderful mapping manuscript migration project. If you look at that, virtually all the lines are going westwards to Europe and US, so very much reproducing the idea of this being a European-driven process, the translocation of books. But this is just a reflection of the data which is available these days and on the non-presence of libraries like Cairo, Damascus, completely absent in any open data project. So we do not know yet the nuts and bolts of how books were taken out of the Jazar library, but it is clear this happened during the 19th century, when Acre underwent a massive urban decline and depopulation, with other urban centers gaining in importance in the region. Beirut emerged, Jerusalem became something like a city rather than a provincial backwater as it had been in the previous centuries. And the teaching activity in the Jazar Mosque in Acre seems to have stopped during this period, and the library lost in significance, and local actors translocated the books to new libraries. So whenever we have somebody where we can trace the first new owner, it's always owners from the region itself, Palestine, Jordan, etc., who took the books out. So in this sense, the Jazar Library is an example of a wider pattern of book circulations in the late 19th century, when the agency of actors in the region should not be underplayed, and where research on provenance should not be focused on one set of actors alone, resurrecting Eurocentric visions of the past. So overall, I've addressed 3 points that seems to me of particular relevance when it comes to thinking about circulation of books, their mobilities, and the histories of translocations. The examples were evidently taken from manuscript cultures across a very wide time span, 600 years, but I hope that the trajectories of the written artifacts contribute to our thinking of how to address the circulation of books in the context of warfare, in the context of scholarly fashions, but also in the context of who are actually the actors who are responsible for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hirschler, for that provocative presentation. Our next speaker this morning is Dr. David Rundle, a Renaissance historian and paleographer who studies the evidence of surviving manuscripts can provide for the circulation of ideas across Europe, from the medieval Mediterranean to Britain. He is based at the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of Kent, where he is senior lecturer in Latin and paleography. His most recent publication is the 2024 article, William Worcester, Sir John Falstaff in Latin Learning, published in the Library, Transactions of the Bibliographical Society. The title of his talk this morning is Europolitan, Thoroughfares, the Movements of Renaissance Manuscripts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers of this wonderful symposium. It's great to be back. We are on the 17th Schoenberg Symposium. I believe I was at the North Schoenberg Symposium. In 2007, it was involved in organising the Treasured Hunt. I was one of the speakers at that, and at that point there was a suggestion that I might be invited back. So here I am, and on that basis, I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here in 2041. There is, as a particular bonus to you, a handout which is being physically moved around the room, but is also downloadable, hopefully through that QR code. I'm going to address the concept of circulation today by following up on a question which is in Doc's wonderful exhibition just next door, which we're going to be looking at in detail later, of how do books move. I'm going to be thinking about the mechanics of the movement within the culture of Europe in that wonderful element of the late Middle Ages, sometimes called as the Renaissance, and definitely part of the Middle Ages. And not just the mechanics, but the mentalities that creates. And do I need to use one of these? Okay, thank you. Do I have to do that all again? My basic proposition is one which I think would be probably obvious to all of us. Books, manuscripts are both reticent and restless. We see them sitting demurely in their old age, in the retirement homes which are their institutional settings, and they hold back on telling us about their adventures, their travels, their exciting daring do's of their previous earlier lives. We have to use all our guile, otherwise known as our paleographical, codicological, philological, and indeed digital skills to get the information out of them. But they do continue to have that hypermobility which makes them so exciting. So 3 sections to what I'm going to be talking about. The first one is a reminder that this restlessness of books does not stop when a book enters an institutional collection. However, the curators might like otherwise. So here is a manuscript which I'm working on, which is in the collection of Magdalen College in Oxford. Yes, that is a quaint Anglicism. It is spelt Magdalene, but think of the adjective Maudlin, and you get the sense of why it's called Magdalen. Now, this is a manuscript, as you can see, from the mid-12th century, which has been in the collection. Magdalen was founded in 1457. This entered the collection probably in the late 1470s, early 1480s. It has many signs of interest in the text, including, as you may be able to make out here, a set of pencil marks in the margin. Something that we probably wouldn't be able to unpack if it was not for the fact that this was rebound using the late medieval binding, but with new boards at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with a note saying this manuscript was sent in 1889 to the Royal Library at Berlin for the use of Professor Theodor Mommsen, by whom, as is believed, the pencil marks which appear on several folios were made. Now, of course, anybody here will probably think that Magdalen got off lightly, because Theodor Mommsen, internationally known as the leading classicist in his lifetime, who was sent books from many collections for his consultation, and he was working on an edition of Cassiodorus, which is why it was there. 1889, thank God it was then, not 1879, because, as you will know, and indeed Marco's nodding at the back there, in 1880, most recently retold by Christopher Hamill in his wonderful book about the book lovers, manuscript lovers club, there was a fire in his house. Books burnt. Theodor Mommsen stood outside and had to be held back from going in to save the books. I want to know who held him back. So the sense in which the book remains in a collection, and I can give lots of other examples of this, it continues into the mid-20th century, that I can give you examples of a book being sent by train, presumably not on its own, up to London for consultation in another library. But this is only a late point in a lively history of this manuscript, because this manuscript, produced somewhere on the continent, there's debate over where that was, came to England in the mid-12th century and was owned by the person we now know as Archbishop Thomas Becket. St. Thomas of Canterbury. From him, it enters into the collection of the Cathedral Priory of Christ Church in Canterbury. Canterbury's worth a visit, by the way. And they see at the very top there, the shelf mark there. And then this institutional owner was willing to alienate the book. It gave it away in the 1470s, probably, and it went into ownership by William Worcester. Thank you for the mention of that. It connects in with that article. And from him, under pressure from the founder of the College of Magdalen, who happened to be one of the most significant politicians in England at the time, and so William Worcester didn't really feel he had any opportunity to say no, the books pass, this book and others pass to the new foundation. And so we know it's in that collection. We know it's in the collection in 1600. It stays in that collection, except, no, it doesn't. There is a note, another one in pencil, Nicholas Greenhill ex dono Henrici Long, which must be just after 1600. It goes out of that library. It becomes, once again, privately owned. But we know that it then gets back because it's in the catalogue of the collection from 1697. I use this as an example of this restlessness, this inability for a book to be fully tethered to a fixed location, or should we say chained to a fixed location. We even know, of course, that chaining doesn't stop a book moving within a library room, or indeed anybody who's been to worked in the Biblioteca Malatestiana in Cesena in Italy will know it can move out of the library room as well. The chain doesn't stop that happening. But there is a sense in which our focus on shelf marks, and maybe also actually the digital surrogates, encourage us to think of a book as settled in a single place. That its awareness, or ubiety in the philosophical term, is overdetermined, and that we should be thinking repeatedly of this as a hypermobile cultural product. And so this takes me on to the second stage. Not just, we can talk about the veracity of the fact of travel, but the velocity of travel. So a key point in a work I produced in 2019 on humanist paleography and the involvement of the English in that supposedly Italian process is this emphasis that the Renaissance is often depicted as a process of slow spread, like ink across blotting paper, or a glass of red wine spilt and poured over a white tablecloth. Neither spread nor slowness identifies, I think, the key characteristics of contact in book culture. Other types of culture, cultural products, architectural styles, for example, yes, we might be talking of slow spread and thus of centres and peripheries. But what I want to emphasize instead is a sense of cultural proximity across Europe. And this is why I use the term Europolitan. Actually, in 2019, I used the term cosmopolitan, but decided that actually that was too grand. This is not the cosmos. This is within a particular small culture in the northwestern corner of the Eurasian landmass, and indeed also it is socially defined among a hypermobile set of human beings, but we'll think about who those human beings are, connected together by a shared language of Latin. But my example for this swift circulation is this manuscript, which is now also in Oxford, but the other end of the town in Balliol. It has been there since the 1470s, 1478, and is a collection of humanist texts. And the contents of this are listed on the handout for you. And by the way, if you are getting bored with this, there's also a good section of Latin on the back with a translation, so you can check my translation and pick me up on it later. But this manuscript was owned by, made for William Gray, future Bishop of Ely, who in 1442 left Oxford, went to Cologne, and then from Cologne went on to Italy, where bizarrely he went round and it was claimed that he was connected to by blood to the king. And it's sort of right, but it rather ignores the fact that his father was executed for trying to assassinate the king's father. But anyway, William Gray clearly had this made before he left for the continent, before December 1442. And it raises an issue because a lot of the texts here are texts which have been produced in the last few years. 1436 is the last definite date. One of them could be as late as 1439. What's going on? How does it get there? Well, in the 1990s, it was noticed that the same set of texts, the same order, are in this manuscript in Padua. It was assumed at the time that there must have been a shared prototype or some other way in which there's a connection between the two. However, we can take that story further. This is the manuscript in Padua. Notice, it's in Padua, It's got Bianchi-Girari initials. It is in a fine humanist script. The assumption taken in the old world is if something looks Italian like this, assume it is Italian. We should not, because in this case, though this may have been produced in Italy, but not necessarily, the scribe is known from other manuscripts, including one which was once owned by Larry Schoenberg. I've never seen this manuscript, so I'm very grateful to Penn for having the images of the Schoenberg manuscripts. It was sold at Sotheby's in 2012. I was out of the country at the time, so I wasn't able to see it. I asked Sotheby's to contact the owner to see whether I could see it, and they came back and said, we contacted the owner, and the owner's response is, I don't know where it is. So the digital surrogate is essential for the study of this. However, I hope that you can see, if you look on the left with this, oops, I need to go back. If you look at the letter G there, or the ampersand, if you look at the letter G with this very angular lower bowl to it, or the ampersand there, these are by the same scribe. And we know who the scribe of this manuscript was. It was somebody from the Netherlands, Petrus Lomer, who we know from other evidence worked in England in the late 1430s. So how is this manuscript by Petrus Lomer connected to that other Balliol manuscript? Next stage. There's also annotations in this manuscript. You can see this pointing hand here and a note here. Well, we can identify who that was. Turn to the second side of the handout and you will have a sample of annotations from another manuscript. They're by Pietro del Monte, who was the papal collector in England for 5 years between 1435 and 1440. It seems to me that what's happening is this manuscript of the latest things available is being produced possibly in Ferrara, Florence, or in Basel, and being taken by an itinerant Dutch scribe, taken to the Italian collector working in England, who then lends it to the Englishman William Gray, who gets somebody to copy it. But notice the time span. No slow spread here. Within less than 5 years, in some cases perhaps months, availability from one end of Europe to the other. This is what I want to emphasize. The process of the velocity of hypermobility. But if we're going to think of that, we also need to think about how things travel. In this case, presumably Petrus Lomer carried the book himself to England, probably because we know he was there. In other cases, we know, and this is another case which is really interesting, and I don't have time to go into it in detail, so ask me afterwards, of Coluccio Salutati, who was the preeminent scholar before the first 15th century generation of humanists, the godfather of the Florentine humanists like Leonardo Bruni. This is his major work. This is the only the complete copy of it. This complete copy left Florence in the 1430s. After he dies in 1406, this is there. It's allowed to be bought up by an Englishman, Andrew Hollis, who takes it to England, and then Erasure there hands it to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who we're about to meet again. The Florentine biographer Vespasiano de Bastici says of Andrew Hollis that he bought up and commissioned so many books while he was in Italy that he had to commission or hire a ship. But let's think about that process of travel and the availability of the ships to make this possible. So, the final section of this talks about those vectors of travel, but also the vagaries of travel. Yes, I'm jet lagged, but at least my plane was on time, there was no problems, but we've all had those issues. Those issues are not an invention of our style of travel. they have their 15th century equivalents. The two examples that I'm going to give are related together in that they are books which were commissioned for the son, brother, and uncle of kings, as he liked to call himself, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, youngest brother of Henry V, who Henry saved at the Battle of Agincourt because he was too rash. And indeed, it's often thought that in politics he was too rash. He was also hot-headed, tight-fisted, but people say at least he loved books. And there are two humanists from Italy who I'm going to concentrate on. On the left-hand side, Leonardo Bruni, the preeminent, internationally recognized leading scholar of the Studia Humanitatis in the first half of the 15th century. On the right, the person who wanted to replace him. Never did, but wanted to. Pier Candido di Cembrio, who was based in Milan. Both of these present works to Humphrey. Leonardo Bruni presents to him his translation of Aristotle's Politics. Pier Candido di Cembrio, not to be outdone, presents to him a translation of Plato's Republic. In both cases, we know how the books travelled. And so, in the case of Leonardo Bruni, we know because there were problems. This is what's in the Latin on the back of the handout and also the English translation, which is up on the screen. There are several elements I want to pick out of here. So, the secretary of Humphrey has written to Leonardo Bruni and said, "You promised this book, where is it?" You can also already sense the anxiety of distance, physical distance here. I want to have the book. And the response is that, first of all, notice it's taken a long time for the letter to reach him, because, of course, there aren't simply postal addresses. People move round, particularly if they're trying to escape the plague, as Leonardo Bruni was. And so something which would usually take 6 weeks, 4 weeks, going really fast to cross Europe, has taken several months. And then he says, effectively, yes, the book is made. It's with me. I can't send it to you yet because of the wars which are going on in Flanders. Now, this is just after, this is part of the 100 Years' War, and it's when the Burgundian-English alliance has fallen apart, and Humphrey himself is involved in attacking the former Burgundian allies, and this is creating issues in the Channel and the North Sea. Yeah, and so war is not destroying, but disrupting the possibility, the expectation of easy transport. But notice that there is an assumption that the process of transportation can take place and is an accepted structure. There is the mention there of the Borromei, one of the leading banks, so-called banks, they're merchant companies, is with outlets across Europe, which work as the communication agency. And they use the developing structure of technology of the carracks from Genoa, the galleys from Venice, as well as from Florence, to transport materials. And books can be one of those materials which travel in the usual structure, but this is one case when it doesn't work as expected. You'll be pleased to know that the book does eventually get there. We don't have it, but we have copies from it. What happens is that it arrives, Humphrey's not very happy because it doesn't have a dedication to him. So Fulvisi has to write back, his secretary has to write back and ask for something to be sent. And so a letter providing presentation is sent and is added to the copies in England. I mention this because we all should think about books don't travel alone. We need to think about the paraphernalia with which they travel, and sometimes become included with them and sometimes excluded in the process of travel. And we'll see that second point in a moment. In Milan, Pier Candido di Cembrio with his black heart, smiles to hear of the discomfort of Leonardo Bruni, and takes the opportunity at that point to propose to the Duke that he will redeem his name by translating for him something better than Aristotle's Politics, Plato's Republic. Well, some taste. And he goes about the process and produces several manuscripts to demonstrate his good faith, expecting them to be able to cross Europe. A copy of Book 5, first of all, then a copy of the first 5 books, and then, and we don't have this last part, all 10 books of the Republic. But he doesn't use the established structures of the banks and of the ships. Instead, what he does is use staging posts, is use other individuals to add to the cachet of the book. And so he claims association with Zanone de Castiglione, who was in Lancastrian Normandy, the Bishop of Bayeux. Remember, this is the point in which the Henry V's conquering of northern France has created an area under English control, and so it is the English who provide him to the bishopric of Bayeux. Zanone de Castiglione is a nephew of a cardinal. He's at the councils in Basel and in Italy. He's not often, sometimes, but not often in Bayeux. But he does have there a secretary. The secretary, and this is not his hand, obviously, but this is a copy made there of his letters, is Rolando Talenti. Rolando Talenti is known to Pier Candido de Cambrio. He makes the connection with Humphrey via Talenti, sending the book not directly to England, but to Bayeux, where it can have extra letters added to them to be sent on to Humphrey. Those letters do not survive. And through that also a supposed association with the local bishop, Zanone de Castiglione, who then actually owns this, wants this to be the case, and becomes a patron or a middleman to this process. And so when Humphrey gets the book, he, as was his wont, adds at the end his name, says it's his, and says it's a gift du don of Pierre Candidus, secrétaire du Duc de Milan. A sense in which it associates him with Milan and with the structures there, but not with those processes which have allowed it to take place. There is in some ways an obfuscation of the complexity, or we would say the richness of the associations which are created. The number of hands which necessarily have been on this book to ensure that it can move from Milan to the palace of the Duke at Greenwich in South London, or not what's now South London. And so what I'm suggesting with these examples is that there are multiple possible routes by which the Europolitan structures can work, and that we need to attend not just to the fact that a book is in one place, then in another place, but in the routes that they take, in the people who make those routes possible, the intermediaries, whether they be patrons, brokers, go-betweens, couriers, fixers, in recent terminology. And Lisa said yesterday, quite rightly, that what attracts us all to these books is the human stories we can make from them. You can have the book in front of you, and you can, from that, create a sense of the human beings around it. Yes, we can do that. And those contacts between the human beings are made possible by the books. And the availability of the books is made possible by the technology of travel that sits behind them. And it is only by combining the paleographical, the codicological, the philological, the digital together with our sense of this wider milieu, that I think that we can create a new cultural history of the Europolitan. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Rundle. That was fascinating. Our rounding out the session this morning is Xin Wen, a historian of medieval China and Inner Asia in Princeton's Department of East Asian Studies and the Department of History. His first book, published in 2023 by Princeton Press, was The King's Road, Diplomacy and the Remaking of the Silk Road. It proposed a new interpretation of the history of the Silk Road as a diplomatic rather than commercial network. He's currently working on his second book, tentatively titled Chang'an, The Death and Rebirth of China's Eternal Capital, 900 to 1400. And he's also working with two other scholars to study and translate a massive cache, his words, of 120,000 third century Chinese documents from Zhoumalo in Changsha, Hunan province. The title of his talk today is Manuscript and Intelligence, the Circulation of Military Information in Tang, China. Thank you.
Thank you for the. Okay, should be. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for the to the organizers for inviting me. You kind of already done the job for my first two slides, so I'm going to repeat what you said. So I'm bringing the discussion to a different geographical region in China and Central Asia, but I'm also talking about manuscripts that are found in a different setting, which is archaeology. All the things that I talk about are not books that are preserved through libraries, but manuscripts that were found in places that are very diverse. Actually, I'll get to that. So this is the world in which most of the manuscripts that I work with look like. And my previous work, my first book, is about the group of manuscripts discovered in this place. Dunhuang, as you can see, is sort of western part of China, going to Central Asia. And this is the cover of the book. The manuscripts are all discovered in this little chamber. That's the size of that corner in front. And this is a chamber that was used as a library in the in the Chinese context in the medieval times. That for some reason that we still don't know was then sealed and painted over in the early 11th century, around 1010, and rediscovered only in 1900. So it stayed sealed for about 900 years. And this is, ignore this guy. Well, he's very important. His Paul Pelliot is maybe the greatest sinologist of all time, but I want to show you what's happening behind him, which is the pile of manuscripts. And if you can see, these are the same mural painting of the trees here. And there were about 60,000 manuscripts. And by definition, they all date to before the year around 1010. And they're written in Chinese, but also Tibetan, Sogdian, Khotanese, Uyghur, some Sanskrit, and then one Hebrew. So I kind of, in my first book, I used these documents to study the history of the Silk Road. This was published last year. And I had also been collaborating with a group of with two other scholars on another group of I think I can still call it manuscript, even though it wasn't written on paper, from this place in South China. And the book actually was published this year, State and Local Society in Third Century South China. This is a group of more than 100,000 wooden and bamboo slips that were all dumped into a well. This is an archaeological, the process of the archaeological discovery. And you can see the workers are removing these muds into bins, and the wooden and bamboo documents were basically in there. And after removal and cleaning up, you have things like this. These are mostly administrative documents. So these are things that I have worked on. Today, I'm talking about something that I'm planning to do in the future, which is so I've shown you documents or manuscripts discovered here and here, right? So now I'm talking about more Western area, which is now these are places located in Xinjiang. Sometimes it's called Eastern Central Asia. One thing to note about this area is that this is a very dry area. So it's mostly desert, oases, towns around deserts. And that is a crucial factor in the preservation of manuscripts. So the two groups, I'll give you a few examples from two places. Number one, Turfan, number two, Khotan. And the first group of manuscripts from Turfan that, there is a very long sort of chronological span. But I'm mostly talking about things that are that date to the 6th and 7th century and 8th century. And most of them are discovered in graves. So this is the sort of corridor leading to the tomb chamber. And this is what it looks like, from top, from this is sort of the side view, right? You dig this tunnel, and then the dead is buried here. And this is what it looks like from top down. Why do we have manuscripts in graves? Some of them are buried with the dead. There are messages to the underworld. There's famously a person who carried all the contracts that contained the debt that hadn't been paid with him into the grave. So these are one category of manuscripts. So these are intentional burials of manuscripts. I'm primarily talking about, and so 2 to 6, so these dots, right? These locations, 4, 5, 6, these are all places where paper manuscripts are discovered. But a additional category of manuscripts that are preserved in graves come in the form of paper shoes and paper hats. Because when you bury someone, you need to have shoes and hats for them. And when you're not rich enough to use real shoes and real hats, you make them with paper. And you also don't want to use new paper, which is great for us. So when we discover these, open these caves, you find shoes like this. And then when you open them up, they have manuscripts and documents on them. Wow. So this is the number one category, the sort of, not category, number one location, the Turfan manuscripts. Further west, this is sort of southern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. These are another group of manuscripts that are discovered in Khotan. And they, unlike the Turfan documents, they are mostly discovered in sand-buried archaeological sites, like houses, monasteries, clearly there was a process of desertification, that people left these places and manuscripts along with them. So when they were re-excavated, sometimes manuscripts are discovered on site. And this is a photo of a buried, I think, monastery, small chamber from a place called Denevulek in Khotan. This is a deserted fort. And in this fort, hundreds of paper documents were discovered, along with documents in wood. So here's a photo of me standing at the same location. The photo here is taken by Stein, or Stein in the early 20th century. This is me in front of the same fort in 2009. Not much has changed in terms of the fort itself. And this is what some of these documents look like, meaning that they are, so unlike the first group of documents discovered in Turfan, which if they're buried intentionally, they're often complete. But if they're cut into paper shoes and paper hats, they are not complete, but they are incomplete in patterned ways. By the way, there is one of the most spectacular sort of discoveries in these tombs is that there was an entire complete coffin that somehow was made of paper. So you can imagine the amount of documents that would preserve. In Khotan, on the other hand, because these documents have been exposed in the sandy desert for, in most cases, more than 1,000 years, they are fragmented, and they're fragmented in unpredictable ways. So this is the sort of base of the sources that I'm talking about. And the historical issue that I want to address with these documents is the Tang, or the Tang is the name of the Chinese dynasty at the time, its conquest of Central Asia. So this is easy to understand because of the discovery of these documents in these places. Especially many of them are written in Chinese. These are not places where people spoke Chinese, most of them, except for Turfan. All these other places where people spoke some sort of Indo-European language at this time. So the discovery of the paper documents there, therefore, reviews the process of the Chinese conquest of Central Asia. I will just give you a very quick timeline. The Tang dynasty used to, the capital is Chang'an here. It's limited at the beginning to the area of North China. In 619, it defeated a warlord here and then expanded into this area that we call the Hexi corridor. And then 630, it defeated the Eastern Turkic Empire to the north, and then conquered Turfan in 640. And then in 7 years later, the emperor stationed some armies in all these different places in modern Xinjiang. And then, but between 647 and 692, there was a prolonged process of kind of fight over these places between the Tibetan Empire, the Tibetans, the Chinese, and the Turks. And it wasn't until 692 when the Tang stationed 30,000 soldiers in these places and consolidated the Chinese rule there. And that rule was lasted, I'll go to the very end, for just about 100 years, and when the Tibetan and the Uyghur forces drove the remnants of the Tang military out. And during that 100 years, obviously you have very historical events such as the Battle of Talas, 751, and Anlushan Rebellion, 755. So this is sort of the historical background that is the context of my my research. And this is a timeline that we learn from Chinese historical sources. They often tell us the traditional sort of books, if you will. They tell us things like the emperor sent army to such and such place, or the emperor learned the invasion of an enemy force at such and such a place. So we can have the contour of the conquest. We can establish the contour of the conquest on the basis of these traditional printed, eventually historical records. What we can do then on the basis of that, using manuscripts, is to substantiate how this process played out on the ground in Central Asia. So I will first, now I will actually delve into the manuscripts themselves. This is a manuscript from Turfan that is about collecting military information. It is at the Princeton Library collection. So you know how it got there. It's its own talk that, but I'm inspired by the talks that I've heard to sort of think more about the provenance. But today I'll focus on the content. So the document starts by saying that Gaochang County messages Wucheng City. So this is a smaller city. The county is an administrative level above it. So that's what it says. And you can see the layout signifies the distinction of these two places. So what does it say? It says that, and this is the message, right? This is the message that's being sent. In the 3rd hour tonight, we received a missive from Tianshan County that claims. So it's quoting a message from a different county. So what does that message say? That message says, we received a missive from Zhang Changnian, the head of the Hepan garrison, that claims. So it's quoting another message. What does that message say? It says, at dusk on the 4th day of this month, I heard from the oral report from 2 Scots who says, we still don't have the message. And this is the actual message. So the message says, we have been sent to this place to investigate the bandits, meaning enemies. And at the Chen hour, and I'll get to when that is, on the 3rd day, we traveled to the mouth of this valley and saw in the distance 2 places on top of the ridge where watchtowers were visible. And Zhang, Fushi, and others immediately hid into the bushes of willow trees and moved closer. Only then did we see that these were people on top of the ridge, there were people on top of the ridge. Now that we could see many personnel above and below, meaning around these 2 locations, we realized that they were enemy forces. After waiting until the dusk, he and others tried to look up for the beacon fire and could not see any. So no movement at this point. Therefore, we could not determine how many bandits there were. And after this message is concluded, and this is going back to this level of information, we have, it says that we have received the notice and do not dare not to report. And it continues to talk about what happened with them, but this manuscript, as you can see, broke off, so we don't know what happened after that. So if we put the kind of data that's contained in this manuscript on the map, we can see that this is what happened. And this is the good thing about manuscripts being discovered archaeologically, is that we often know exactly where they're from. And this manuscript mentions a lot of the places that we can identify on a map. So if we rearrange the events that's documented in the manuscript, we know that between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. on the 3rd day of this month, I forgot which month it was, Zhang Fushi and Bo Junluo, these two people, first observed the bandit in the mouth of the mud rich valley here. And the night of the 3rd, so the night of that day, they said they could not estimate how many enemies were there. So they were hidden in the bushes like for the whole day, right? Trying to observe, and eventually they could not really tell. Nonetheless, they reported on the dusk of the 4th day, they went to Hepan garrison. So they went from this point to this point and informed another person of what they saw. This person then, the night of that day, wrote to the Tianshan County here. And then between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on the 5th day, Tianshan County informed Gaochang County, this county, about 50 kilometers to the east. And then between 11 p.m. on the 5th and 1 a.m. on the 6th, it's really working very late into the night, the clerks of Gaochang County here received a message from Tianshan County, right? You can see how long it took for the message to get there. It's within 1 day. And then we don't know when, because the manuscript isn't complete. The message was then sent to this subordinate location in order to prepare for possible invasion. So this is a good example to show how information is being communicated on the ground. So this is the example number 1. And then this happened in 656, 16 years after the Tang conquered Turfan. And this is where that was happening. And this is, so I sort of shrank the map to match the scale so you can see, the dots still. The second document that I want to talk about is from Khotan. And unlike the Turfan documents, this is, because this is a non-Chinese speaking area, this is a bilingual document. I've transcribed them, and the language that's spoken in Khotan is Khotanese. This is a Middle Iranian language, Eastern Middle Iranian language like Sogdian, Bactrian, spoken basically from the 4th, at least, century until the 10th in the southern half of the Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang. And as you can see, from just the look of it, that the Chinese is written, this way, goes from right to left, and then top to bottom, and then the Khotanese is you have to sort of switch it 90 degrees. It's from left to right, and then from also top to bottom in this orientation. What does this document say? It says, well, this is actually my transcription of the text in Khotanese and Chinese, but here is the translation. The first line of Chinese, and the Chinese is translated in blue. The camel rider Sang Yiben reported orally that I've heard the Shenshan Fort, ... Shenshan Fort is the fort that I was standing in front of in that photo I showed. So this is basically someone in a residential area talking about what happened from a military fort. So again, going back, you can see all broken down. I think the bottom is probably complete here, but the top is not. So all the sentences are fragmentary. And then it says 3 portal servicemen along with 3 camels in the Mao hour, very early morning. Something happened, don't know. And then we receive the news. Please report to those who come. According to the petition, please issue notifications. This is all about, we got the news. We're sending news to you. Please just let everybody know. So what's going on? What do people have to know? men and livestock should all be assembled back into the city, into the Kancheng city for protection. If there is any oversight, probably something will happen to you, but we don't know. And then they will be published, they will not published, punished. And thus I report. And then it talks about the date, the person who's in charge, and everyone who oversaw this communication, all the way up to the king of Khotan at the time. So this is the Chinese part. If we go back to this document, the green line is where I translated the Khotanese part. Is that they beat the drum. This is, as far as I can tell, not in the Chinese part, and it says camel rider did something. The camel rider part is in the Chinese. And then it says to make something, not really sure what that is. When you hear the order, transfer all the individual men and livestock that you have to the city of Pema, which is the Chinese Kancheng, and you will incur plenty of guilt if you don't do something, presumably, right? On the fourth day of the second months, the order went out. So, and then the final part of the sort of personnel information that is contained in the Chinese manuscript, we don't see a Khotanese equivalent. So if we look back at the manuscript, I think this, looking at the content and the layout of the text, it's pretty clear that the Chinese text is supposed to be the main text. It's an official document that is issued by the king. And then when the message went out locally to the city, someone who worked there wrote interlinear Khotanese note about important thing, meaning that some news came to me, then you need to assemble the men and livestock into the city for protection, and if you don't do it, you will be punished. These are the key informations that were translated into Khotanese. So this is example number 2. The last example, and this is discovered here, right? The last example, oh, by the way, the second document is, you might have noticed the shelf number is Swen heading. We call it heading document. It is currently in Sweden. Again, there will be a lot of interesting provenance stories to tell why a document from Khotan is now in Sweden. The last document, the provenance is a little bit simpler. This is a recently discovered manuscript. It is, I think, in the Xinjiang Archaeological Center or Bureau. And this is important because new things are still being discovered in newly excavated caves and newly blown, clear by some strong wind, sandy settlements. The saying goes that if there is a strong wind and somewhere in the area around Khotan, you will see a new settlement and there will be things that you can discover. And this is one example where that happened. And it is a document about really nothing happening. So it is this beacon's petition to a garrison, right? You have beacon towers and people at the beacon tower writing letter to a garrison, a bigger settlement. It says, regarding the interception on this road, so people are observing this road and trying to intercept whatever that looked suspicious. It said, upon your order, I have been trying to intercept every day on the road mentioned above. I have not seen any traces of saddles and horses, only traces of cows. So not military movement, only maybe regular people. And cautiously, I report this message to you. And this is discovered here on this road between Turfan and Khotan. So to sum up, this is my last slide. when we see in transmitted historical sources that the emperor received a piece of military intelligence that says, for instance, the invasion, that talks about the invasion of an enemy force, that obviously helps us understand the contour of the military action. But what the manuscript allows us to see is the making of such military intelligence. That included, if we think back at the manuscript that we talked about, oral transmission of information, visual verification, right? And then the transcription of the orally transmitted message, and in the case of the bilingual document, the translation of key messages, and then the constant reports of, even if nothing happens, you still have to keep your superiors updated about that fact. And the manuscript, these paper manuscripts flowed efficiently through the postal network of the empire. And this is what, as much as the soldiers that the emperor sent, this is the other important aspect that allowed an empire like the Tang dynasty to control a large area in Central Asia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was such an interesting talk. I'd like to invite the speakers to come to the table, please. We have just under 15 minutes for some Q&A. I'm going to walk with the microphone as I did yesterday so that the room can hear.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for a fantastic opening panel. Thank you for that. I enjoyed that very much and learned a lot. I have two quick questions for Konrad, if that's all right. One is about the movement of that first example of the Tripoli manuscript to finding its way to Damascus. And I wondered if there are other ways to, we speculate on how it got there. And I wondered if there are other models for how a book might have found its way. I'm thinking about refugees, for example, or maybe even Fakhr himself, right? He abandons Tripoli and then tries to get help. And there's a lot of discussion in the Arabic sources about his household and that he brings with him passes through Damascus briefly. And I wonder if that is another possible vector for that book to find its way to Damascus and eventually in the Kubut al-Khazna. That's one question. The second question was also very quick, I think. I hope it will be. You've really shown, I think, the involvement of local actors in the disbursement of Arabic manuscripts in the Ottoman period. But the famous ones are always the ones that wind up in Europe. But sometimes those manuscripts are purchased using middlemen in the region, right? Who are purchasing manuscripts in the book markets, and they're often Christians rather than Muslim middlemen. And I wonder if you could speculate on how some of these projects of acquiring manuscripts for, let's say, royal libraries or European libraries, how they were able to gain access to collections that were in, let's say, at the Jazan Mosque, or how these books wound up in the book market to become purchased in the first place.
Mm. Yeah, thanks. So on the first question, rather like this one. First question, basically then Tripoli going to Damascus. I assume plunder, Frankish, selling to Muslims in Damascus, and you're entirely right. I mean, there could be a straight arrow going down from Tripoli to Damascus of basically migration shortly before the conquest, because the coward Banu Ammar family disappears from Tripoli and leaves it to the Franks, and that they take valuable items with them, and the parchment manuscript would probably be in an item they might have taken with them to sell it in Damascus. On the second question, yeah, I mean, that's obviously a very big question, the mechanics of the book market in the late 19th century. How did European traders actually got hands on them? And thankfully, we're slowly getting more of an idea of how this is happening. Concretely, in the case of the Al-Jazar Mosque, my assumption is that in the course of the 19th century, because of the urban decline of Acre, because the madrasa, the college, stopped functioning, that there was a de-acquisition of books from the mosque in whatever way. You know, I mean, they are endowed, so theoretically it's difficult to get them out, but there are legal ways to get them out. You could get endowed books out, but there are obviously also illegal ways that just got them out. But in the end, it was a translocation of books because the library started to stop functioning as a madrasa library. There was no function anymore. They started to be dispersed in the region, and then European traders, as far as we can see, mostly bought them in the 1920s, often consuls, German consul, French consul, English consuls, and they were long enough in the region to be connected to book traders, but they did not directly, where I believe that, at least in this case, they were not directly able to crack endowments, so, that they would be able to get them directly from the endowment.
Thank you.
We have a Zoom question?
There are multiple Zoom
questions.
We'll start with one and then I think we can go back and forth. All right, so this question is for David. Lovely, it's from Femke Unterbilgen. Lovely presentation by David Rundle. A question about this Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. To make sure I get the person right, is this the man who married Jacoba von Berlein and tried to win her lands back, or is it someone else?
No, that's absolutely right. That was the first. That was the first marriage, and was a point at which there was putting tension in between 1422 and 1424 on the alliance with the Burgundians, which was in place. But there is a manuscript which was fairly recently identified as having Humphrey's annotations, where he writes an inscription saying to the beautiful Jacques, and then he writes another one saying to the ugly Jacques, and demonstrates that he's taken up another mistress, but that's not the person he marries. He marries then one of the servants of Jacqueline, Eleanor Cobham. And Eleanor Cobham then in the early 1440s is accused of witchcraft in the hoping to find out when Humphrey will become king after Henry VI. Yeah, it's that man. Yeah.
Do we want to stay on Zoom? We did have a question in the room. We can come back to Zoom.
My question is for Xin Wen. Fascinating talk. I'm very curious about the shoes and hats and coffin that are constructed from the documents. I wonder if you could speak about the relationship between the archaeological objects that are constructed of the documents and then their dismantling, and kind of how the objects are studied by archaeologists, and then what the process of dismantling them looks like.
Thank you. So this is a struggle between historians like myself, who wants to read the manuscripts, and archaeologists who want to preserve the shape of the object, right? And for the longest time, historians were winning. The shoes were being dismantled and disassembled. The hats were being disassembled. When I worked with my my academic advisor when I was a master's student in Turfan in 2008, 7 and 8, we were handling these manuscripts that were recently discovered, and we're trying to sort of reimagine the shape that they wore as pieces of shoes and hats in order to kind of reconstruct the shape of the document. Because, the way that you, for instance, you make the sole of a shoe is that you fold this document several times and then you kind of cut it, right? And what you have is only the one, the sole, but you had to sort of imagine that process and then reverse engineer it so that you can actually recreate the document. And we were able to recreate a document that was a very long document about a very mundane matter. The local office needs to repair its doors. But it was interesting nonetheless. But recently, what has been happening is that archaeologists have been saying, you need to stop. These shoes are important artifacts in themselves. And we understand that you want to read what's inside, but the old practice of, whenever you see something, the only goal is to try to identify the text should be abolished. And now there are more and more of these sort of objects that are discovered intact, and I kind of partially agree with that. I think they're important objects, and maybe in the future there might be technology that we can have to be able to read the text without destroying, or at least the paper object. But for now, I think if we decide to preserve them the way they are, we probably will just have to wait to see what's inside.
All right. Next question. This is Elisa Beer, and the question is for Konrad. She says, thank you for an engaging and fascinating talk. I loved the microhistory of the title page. I deeply appreciate the codicological and historical depth you brought to the analysis. I also appreciate you pointing out that our data sets are deeply skewed. It's so easy to overlook such facts. Question. I wonder if models of data sovereignty, such as those used for managing indigenous collections in the USA/Canada, might be of use in blunting the sense of neo-colonial data grabbing. Or do you have the impression that many libraries, such as Cairo, are simply fully opting out of IIIF/linked open data / et cetera?
Sensitive topic. I mean, to cut a very long story short, I would say in the moment it's an opting out, but it's not, because I think there has not been a serious engagement. And so other models of data sovereignty, which might be out there, if they are seriously proposed and put into practice and seen that it actually works, it might be that these institutions go along this way. It's not that I think it's a completely hopeless thing, but as far as I can see, there has not been a serious engagement with this question, but rather an expectation of funding bodies which were not fulfilled and a withdrawing of funding bodies. Plus the problem that there is, many of these kind of Damascus, it's pretty difficult to engage in the moment with the Syrian state library on open data policies because of the sanction regime. So we just can't do it.
Maybe we have time for one last question. All right.
Thank you. This was such a fascinating panel. I loved all of your presentations. My question is to Professor Wen. I'm deeply intrigued by this wonderful travel of information, and I keep on wondering how the materiality of this thing can teach you more about the validity of the information. It's wonderful how you have materials that reflect on the orality of the message, especially the last one. I just thought, don't you need, just like a set of people who are going to send you the information, like nothing happens there, yet this information at some point becomes textualized, it assumes material reality and travels in this particular way. So I keep on wondering about what your project can teach us even more about how information functions, or the truthfulness or believability of the information is produced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important topic, because a lot of times what we see in these documents, and I have examples of this that I didn't have time to show, if we can call this a regime of paper document, one of the most crucial part of it is the verification of information that's produced by itself. So you have documents about documents, if you will, I worked on this document that is produced by someone who examines all the documents that came into the office and checked to see if the seal is correctly applied or not. And in that document, it lists all the documents whose seals that they checked. So yeah, I agree with you. Studying that really allows you to understand how this empire of paper document functioned on the ground in a way that we really could not have learned just by transmitted book historical sources alone. So thank you.
All right. Well, with that, why don't we break for lunch? We're going to reconvene at 1:30. Please give a hand to the speakers. Thank you very much.